When trying to make a decision, you probably have a few factors that you're considering to help you figure out what the best alternative is. In multi-criteria decision-making, the things that matter to us when deciding between different alternatives are called criteria. Maybe we're looking for a new house to buy, and we're concerned about the size, the view, and the number of rooms. Or maybe we want to hire a new candidate for a job, and we want to look at their education, their experience, and personality. In this example, we'll be looking at a new smartphone to buy, so we will consider the camera quality, the battery life, and reviews, among other things. When choosing our criteria, we want to make sure they're preferentially independent. That means that, for example, we can't use both color and beauty as criteria at the same time, because likely if something has a color that we like, then we'll also find it more beautiful. So those two criteria aren't preferentially independent. And if we were to include both, it will be double counting, which would skew our results. But on the other hand, being preferentially independent doesn't mean that the criteria have to be completely independent of each other. For example, we can want a phone to be both light and have a large screen, even though generally the larger the screen, the heavier the phone. The difference is that our preference for screen size does not depend on our preference for weight, which is why we can list both size and weight as considerations. The other thing to keep in mind is to enter the costs and other considerations, like purchasing price or brand, separately from our criteria. This is because having costs and considerations separate from our criteria helps us better analyze our alternatives. For this example, we'll keep the criteria focused on things like how good the camera is, and we can weigh that up against costs later using the value for money chart in the alternative selection page. So let's start adding our criteria. If we want some inspiration or ideas for possible criteria, we can use the AI assistant to generate criteria for us. This is really helpful in getting started quickly, and you may be surprised by how good some of the suggestions can be. If you already have some criteria in mind, then you can add them manually. We type the name of our first criterion in the box here, so let's say camera quality to start with. Below the criterion name, we need to add levels. In this case, maybe poor, average, and add another level for excellent. Note that the levels should be ordered from lowest ranked on top to highest ranked on bottom. Otherwise, the trade-off questions won't make any sense later on. In some cases, it will be helpful to clarify what factors feed into assessing whether a criterion is rated poor or good, and so on. One way to do this is by adding a long name underneath the criterion name. This is the name that will be displayed during the trade-offs. For camera quality, for example, we might include resolution, aperture, and color accuracy. It's good to keep the main criterion name shorter, so it can still fit nicely in charts and graphs. Now let's add some new criteria by clicking New Criterion at the bottom here. You can also copy any existing criterion with its levels by clicking this icon to the right of the criterion name. To delete a criterion, we click the little garbage icon to the right. It may be interesting to see how our results may differ by excluding one or more of our criteria. We can test this out by clicking the Disable option. This way, the criterion will not be included on the alternatives page, in the trade-offs, or in the results, either for us or for any other participant in the case of voting or a survey. This option can also be useful if you want to focus on other criteria instead, without deleting any existing criteria. It would be good to get an idea of how many trade-off questions decision makers will have to answer to establish weights for the criteria and levels. We can find this out by clicking How many trade-offs up here. The number of trade-off questions depends on the number of criteria we have and the number of levels for each criterion. So if you wanted to include more criteria or more levels, you will have to answer more questions. Normally, it's good to stay below 40 questions, so this is a good number. But if you want to reduce the number of questions without cutting down on the number of criteria or levels, one thing we can do is go to the options and disable auto-interpolation and manually select some levels to be interpolated. This means that decision makers won't have to answer questions involving this level. and the relative importance of this level will be calculated based on the weights of the levels above and below it. If we don't like the terms criteria or levels, we can change them to any term we want to use instead by going to the Options menu. For example, I might want to call criteria attributes, or I can enter a custom term as well. Then it will update criteria to the term I choose. Lastly, if there are some combinations of criteria and levels that are impossible, and if it would be confusing or nonsensical to ask decision makers a question involving those combinations, we can specify such combinations on the Impossible Combinations tab, so that these combinations will be avoided in the trade-off questions. This also reduces the number of questions people have to answer. So now that we've entered our criteria, the next step would be to enter our alternatives if we have any, or we can just go straight to the trade-offs.